Picture this, a pristine suburban lawn, the kind you'd see in a glossy real estate ad, suddenly marred by the deep, ugly tread marks of a patrol truck. Not just any truck, mind you, but one emblazoned with the logo of the neighborhood's homeowners association, its amber lights flashing like a cheap disco ball. Now imagine that truck, a Ford Ranger no less, nose first in a meticulously dug 8-foot pit, its back end jutting skyward like a beached whale. Sounds like the kind of suburban legend you'd hear at a barbecue and laugh about over a cold beer, right? Well, this isn't a tall tale. It's my story, and it's one of calculated retribution, petty tyrants, and a lawn that became a battlefield. My name is Jack Thornton, and this is how I took on the HOA and won. I'm a retired guy, 62 years old, who spent 3 decades running a small excavation and demolition business. Nothing fancy, just honest work moving dirt, tearing down old sheds, and making room for new builds. 6 months after I settled in, everything changed. Enter Margaret Voss, the newly elected HOA president. Margaret wasn't just a stickler for rules. She was a walking, talking monument to control. Think of someone who organizes their spice rack alphabetically and probably measures their morning coffee with a ruler. That's Margaret. She didn't see the HOA as a way to keep the neighborhood running smoothly. Oh no. To her, it was a kingdom, and she was its unchallenged queen. Within weeks of her coronation, laminated notices started popping up on every community bulletin board. New rules, each more absurd than the last. Your curtains had to be an approved shade of taupe. Kids couldn't laugh too loudly during quiet hours, which seemed to be all day, and heaven help you if your mailbox flag wasn't regulation size. Then came Margaret's crowning glory, the Willow Creek Community Patrol. Picture a leased Ford Ranger, white as a hospital wall, with Community Patrol stenciled on the side in bold letters, and those ridiculous amber lights flashing for no reason. The patrol was manned by 2 guys who looked like they'd been rejected from a rent-a-cop gig at the local mall. There was Carl, the driver, a heavy-set guy with a perpetually flushed face and a wheeze that suggested he'd never met a staircase he liked. His sidekick, Eddie, was leaner, with a habit of polishing his sunglasses at every opportunity, even in the shade. Their job? To crawl through the neighborhood at 5 miles an hour, scowling at anyone whose grass was a smidge too long or whose porch paint showed the faintest chip. It didn't take long for their patrol route to include my front lawn. Not the street in front of my house, mind you, but my actual lawn, me pride and joy, a carpet of Kentucky bluegrass I'd spent months nurturing. The first time it happened, I was in my kitchen, brewing coffee, when I saw the Ranger pull up. Its front tires rolled 3 feet onto my grass, crushing the blades I just fertilized. Carl and Eddie hopped out, stretched like they were on a road trip pit stop, and sauntered off to inspect Mrs. Larson's rose bushes across the street. I was more puzzled than angry. Maybe they didn't realize they were on my property. I stepped outside, a polite smile plastered on my face. "Morning, fellas," I said, keeping my tone light. "This is my lawn, private property. Mind not parking on it? There's plenty of room on the street." Carl, whose gut strained the buttons of his too-tight uniform, gave me a lazy once-over. "HOA business," he grunted, as if that explained everything. Eddie smirked, polishing those damn sunglasses. "Will only be a minute," he said, already turning away. They weren't a minute. They were 20, leaving 2 deep tire tracks in my grass. I fumed, but let it slide. Maybe it was a one-time thing. A misunderstanding. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. 2 days later, they were back. Same spot, same tire tracks, same smug attitudes. This time, I didn't wait for them to wander off. I marched out before they could even kill the engine. "Look," I said, my voice firmer, "I asked you not to park here. This is my lawn, not a public lot. The street's right there, wide open." Carl rolled his eyes, rolled them, like I was some kid whining about a scraped knee. "We need a strategic observation point," he said, puffing out his chest. "This spot gives us optimal visual access to properties under scrutiny." Optimal visual access? They were staring at Mrs. Larson's slightly faded garden gnome. Eddie chimed in, "President Voss says we have discretion on patrol locations." The audacity was something else. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Your discretion stops at my property line. I'm asking you, politely, to move the truck." Carl snorted, a sound so dismissive it made my blood simmer. He backed the Ranger onto the street slowly, grudgingly leaving another set of tracks in my grass. That night, I pulled out my property survey. The lawn was mine, no question. I dug into the HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions pages of Margaret's fine print and found nothing giving the patrol the right to park on private property. There were clauses about respecting homeowners' land. The hypocrisy was glaring. The next morning, I typed up a letter to the HOA board, addressed to President Voss herself. It was polite but firm, detailing the incidents, citing the bylaws, and requesting that her patrol stop using my lawn as a parking lot. I included photos of the tire tracks for good measure. I sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested, and waited. A week passed. No response. But the tire tracks? They kept coming, fresh and bold, like a middle finger etched in my grass. Carl and Eddie started waving at me as they pulled onto the lawn, their smirks practically glowing. My patience, which I'd always prided myself on, was wearing thin. This wasn't just about grass anymore. It was about respect or the complete lack of it. Margaret and her goons were treating my property like their personal playground, and I was done playing nice. I started documenting everything. I bought a notebook and kept it by the kitchen window, jotting down dates, times, and who was driving, usually Carl, occasionally Eddie when Carl was off, probably grabbing donuts. I snapped hundreds of thin close-ups of the tires sinking into my lawn, wide shots showing the truck squatting on my property while the street sat empty. I even splurged on a wildlife camera, the kind hunters use, and hid it in the oak tree by my driveway. It captured Carl and Eddie in all their glory, sometimes picking their noses or arguing about football while patrolling. The footage was gold, but it wasn't enough. I needed allies, and in a neighborhood where Margaret's laminated rules held sway, those were hard to come by. Most folks saw the truck on my lawn, shook their heads, and scurried inside, too scared of Voss's wrath to speak up. Then, one morning, Mrs. Evelyn Carter from 2 houses down stopped me while I was watering my azaleas. Evelyn was in her late 70s, with a garden that could make a botanist weep and a knack for spotting neighborhood nonsense. "Jack, dear," she whispered, her eyes gleaming with conspiracy. "I see those awful men on your beautiful lawn almost every day. It's a disgrace. That Margaret's got them thinking they own the place." Her words were like a shot of whiskey after a long day. Someone else saw the injustice, and it fueled me. Evelyn even mentioned seeing Carl and Eddie laugh as they parked, pointing at my battered grass like it was a joke. That was the moment I knew polite measures wouldn't cut it. I had to escalate. I tried one last time to reason with Margaret directly. I caught her stepping out of her shiny new golf cart HOA funded, naturally, with a little President Voss plaque on the dash near the community pool. "President Voss," I started, keeping my voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside. "Your patrol truck keeps parking on my lawn. I've asked them to stop. I sent a letter. It's damaging my property." She cut me off, raising a hand adorned with gaudy rings. "Mr. Thornton," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, "I received your little note. Our patrol needs strategic positioning for community safety and compliance. Your lawn, while I'm sure it's dear to you, provides an unmatched vantage point. Perhaps you should think about the greater good instead of a few blades of grass." "A few blades of grass?" My blood pressure spiked. "The greater good doesn't give your team the right to trespass or damage private property," I shot back, sharper than I meant. "There are bylaws against this bylaws you helped write." She gave me a tight, venomous smile. "Interpretations vary, Mr. Thornton. As president, my interpretation carries weight. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have community matters to attend to." She breezed past me, leaving me steaming in her wake. That was it. No more Mr. Nice Guy. Margaret Voss had just poked the wrong bear. For 30 years, I'd moved earth, reshaped landscapes, and made problems disappear. She thought I was just a grumpy retiree with a lawn obsession. She had no idea what I was capable of. The idea was forming a bold, slightly insane idea that made my heart race with anticipation. They wanted to park on my lawn. Fine. I'd make sure it was a parking experience they'd never forget. Margaret Voss's dismissal at the community pool wasn't just a slap in the face, it was a declaration of war. Her smug smile and that condescending wave of her bejeweled hand lit a fire in me that no amount of polite letter writing could extinguish. My lawn, my sanctuary, was being trampled by her goons, Carl and Eddie, and she had the gall to call it a few blades of grass for the greater good. I'd spent 30 years in excavation, dealing with stubborn soil, tricky permits, and the occasional difficult client. I knew how to handle obstacles. Margaret didn't know it yet, but she'd just met her match. Back home, I sat in my study, The property survey spread out on the desk, the HOA bylaws bookmarked with sticky notes. The facts were clear. My lawn was private property, and the HOA had no legal right to use it as a parking lot. The bylaws even had a section on respecting homeowners' land, highlighted in yellow from my late-night reading. Margaret's interpretation might carry weight in her mind, but it wouldn't hold up in a court of law or the court of public opinion, which I was starting to think might be my real battlefield. I started treating the situation like a job site. In my old business, you didn't just swing a sledgehammer and hope for the best. You planned, you measured, you anticipated. So I became a one-man surveillance operation. I kept my notebook by the kitchen window, logging every time that white Ford Ranger rolled onto my lawn. Dates, times, duration, driver mostly Carl, with his wheezing swagger, but sometimes Eddie when Carl was off doing whatever wannabe cops do on their breaks. I took photos with my phone, zooming in on the tire tracks gouging my Kentucky bluegrass, then stepping back for wide shots that showed the truck parked defiantly while the street sat empty. The wildlife camera in the oak tree was my secret weapon. It caught Carl and Eddie in candid moments, Eddie polishing his sunglasses like he was in a bad action movie, Carl yelling at a squirrel that dared cross his path. One clip even showed them laughing as they parked, pointing at my lawn like it was their punchline. That footage burned me up, but it also sharpened my resolve. This wasn't just about grass anymore. It was about principle, about standing up to bullies who thought they could do whatever they wanted because they had a logo on their truck. I needed more than evidence, though. I needed a strategy. My letter to Margaret had been ignored, and my face-to-face plea had been brushed off. The neighbors, for the most part, were too cowed by Margaret's laminated reign to help. Except for Evelyn Carter, bless her. A few days after our chat, she slipped me a note while I was pruning my hedges. "Jack," it read in her elegant cursive, "I saw those men park on your lawn again yesterday. They were laughing, pointing at your grass like it was a game. Keep fighting, dear. You're not alone." Evelyn's note was like a spark in dry grass. Knowing someone else saw the injustice gave me a boost, but I also knew I couldn't rely on the neighborhood to rally behind me. Willow Creek was a place where conformity was king, and Margaret's rule, though only a year old, had already silenced most dissent. People grumbled in private, but at HOA meetings, they nodded along to avoid her wrath. If I were going to win this, I'd have to do it myself, and I'd have to make it impossible for Margaret to ignore. My first move was to up the ante with warnings. I drove to the local hardware store and bought 2 heavy-duty metal signposts and materials for custom signs. Back in my garage, I channeled my inner craftsman, creating 2 professional-looking signs, white with bold black letters that read, "Private property. No vehicle parking. Violators will be towed at owner's expense. Surveillance in operation. Clear, legal, and impossible to miss." I planted them at either end of the lawn where Carl and Eddie liked to park, making sure they were visible from the street. I even took photos with that day's newspaper in the frame to prove when they went up. The next day, right on schedule, the Ranger rolled down the street. I watched from my kitchen, coffee in hand, as Carl slowed the truck and pointed at one of the signs. Eddie leaned over, and they both laughed, like my effort was some kind of joke. Then, with a shrug that screamed arrogance, Carl steered the truck right onto my lawn, parking dead center between the 2 signs. The wildlife camera caught it all, the pause, the chuckle, the deliberate defiance. My blood boiled, but I also felt a strange calm. They'd just handed me Exhibit A. That laughter was the final straw. No more letters, no more polite requests. Margaret, Carl, and Eddie thought they were untouchable, that my signs were a bluff. They were about to learn that Jack Thornton didn't bluff. I'd spent decades moving earth, and I knew how to make a point with dirt and gravity. The idea that had been simmering in my hiata pit, a trap, a physical consequence for their trespassing, started to take shape. It was bold, maybe a little crazy, but it felt right. They wanted to park on my lawn. I'd make sure it was a parking experience they'd never forget. I didn't rush into it. Planning a pit like this was no small thing, even for someone with my experience. I sat down with a notepad, not to log their violations, but to map out my response. The spot was obvious. The exact patch of lawn Carl and Eddie favored, now scarred with their tire tracks, conveniently framed by my 2 ignored signs. I estimated the dimensions: 10 feet long, 5 feet wide, 8 feet deep. Deep enough to trap the Ranger without risking damage to my property or the street. I knew the soil here, mostly clay after the top foot of loam, was stable enough for a temporary excavation if done right. The trick was execution. I couldn't just dig a hole and call it a day. It had to be precise, professional, and above all, legal. I wasn't out to destroy their truck. That's vandalism, and I'm no amateur. This was about containment, about making a point they couldn't ignore. I checked my backyard shed, where I still kept some old tools, a heavy-duty spade, a pickaxe, and a couple of sturdy wheelbarrows. More importantly, I had the know-how. 30 years of digging had taught me how to read the ground, how to stabilize a hole, how to make it look like nothing was there. I started the landscaping project on a Friday evening, after Carl and Eddie had clocked off for the weekend. When Mr. Larson, my neighbor across the street, peered over the fence, curious about the noise, I grinned and said, "Just sprucing up the lawn, Tom. A little improvement project?" He nodded, probably thinking I was planting tulips or something equally harmless. The digging was hard work. Breaking through the turf was a slog, and my back wasn't as young as it used to be, but once I hit the topsoil, it became rhythmic. Shovel, lift, and toss into the wheelbarrow. Trundle to the backyard, dump onto a tarp to protect the rest of my lawn, and make backfilling easier. I worked late, using a spotlight to pass it off as gardening enthusiasm. By Saturday afternoon, the pit was done, a neat rectangle, 8 feet deep, with fairly vertical sides thanks to the clay. Standing at the bottom, I felt a grim satisfaction. It was a significant hole, the kind that made you respect the earth's depth. I even carved a slight ramp at one end, thinking ahead to how they'd eventually get the truck out. My hands were blistered, my muscles ached, but I was smiling. This was no longer just a lawn. It was a statement. Now came the fun part, camouflage and new signage. The old signs hadn't been clear enough for Carl and Eddie's limited comprehension, so I went all out. I drove to a professional sign maker, the kind that does city street signs, and ordered 2 heavy-gauge aluminum signs. The wording was a masterpiece of legal jargon I'd cooked up after browsing property law forums and dusting off old contract clauses from my business days. In big, unmissable letters, they read, "Private property. Absolutely no parking or trespassing. Unauthorized vehicles parked or driven on this grassy area will be presumed abandoned and subject to immediate on-site immobilization and/or relocation by subterranean displacement utilizing pre-existing ground installations. Vehicle owner assumes all risk, liability, and cost for recovery. Entry constitutes acceptance of these terms. You have been explicitly warned." I loved that phrase, subterranean displacement. It sounded official, ominous, and perfectly accurate. I installed the signs in the same spots as the old ones, making sure they caught the porch light at night. I took photos and a video, narrating the date and time, panning across the signs and the lawn to document everything. The pit itself needed to blend in seamlessly. I built a lightweight frame of 2x4s, strong enough to hold a sheet of half-inch plywood. On top, I laid spare sod from a previous project, sprinkled with grass clippings and leaves to match the surrounding lawn. To the naked eye, it was just a slightly uneven patch of grass. It wouldn't hold a person's weight if they jumped on it, but it would fool a driver long enough to roll the Ranger's front tires onto it. I tested a corner with my foot, and the plywood creaked just right. Perfect. The trap was set. My lawn, scarred but inviting, was the bait. The signs were clearer than a summer sky. All I had to do was wait for Carl and Eddie to take the plunge literally. I felt like a director staging a play, every detail in place, the curtain about to rise. Margaret and her patrol thought they were above the rules. They were about to learn that some rules are enforced by physics and a very determined retiree. The weekend after I finished digging the pit felt like the calm before a storm. I mowed my lawn carefully, avoiding the camouflaged 8-foot hole, and tended to my flower beds, playing the part of a retired guy enjoying his Sunday. But inside, I was wired, every rumble of a passing car making me glance toward the window. Would Carl and Eddie take the bait? Had my signs, with their ominous talk of subterranean displacement, finally scared them off? Part of me hoped they'd back down, but a bigger part of the part that had spent 30 years outsmarting tricky soil and stubborn clients wanted them to test me. I was ready. Monday came and went without incident. The only vehicles on my street were the garbage truck and a delivery van. I sipped my coffee, read the paper, and tried to ignore the itch of anticipation. Maybe Margaret had reassigned her goons to another part of Willow Creek, ticketing people for unapproved birdhouses or whatever nonsense she'd cooked up next. Tuesday was quieter still. I spotted the HOA Ranger cruising by, Carl at the wheel, Eddie staring out the passenger window like he was auditioning for a tough guy role. They didn't even glance at my house. For a moment, I wondered if my earlier signs had sunk in, or if Margaret had issued some rare, sensible directive. But I knew better. The universe loves a good show, and it was saving the drama for the perfect moment. That moment arrived on Wednesday morning. It was one of those crisp, clear days that make suburban Ohio feel like a postcard. Blue skies, dew sparkling on the grass, Mrs. Larson's roses glowing across the street. I was in my kitchen, savoring a second cup of coffee, when I heard it, the unmistakable growl of the Ford Ranger's engine. My heart gave a sharp thump, like a bass drum kicking off a song. Showtime. I moved to the window, staying just out of sight, with a clear view of the street. The white Ranger, its amber lights off for once, turned onto my block. Carl was driving, his meaty hands gripping the wheel. Eddie sat beside him, sunglasses perched on his nose despite the morning light. They slowed as they neared my house, and I saw Carl's head turn toward the new aluminum signs, their bold letters glinting in the sun. He saw them, I was sure of it. His lips moved, probably muttering some snide remark to Eddie, who nodded with a smirk that was visible even from 30 feet away. The arrogance was almost poetic, so predictable it felt scripted. Carl gestured with his chin toward my lawn, their favorite parking spot. He gave the truck a little gas, turning the wheel. The front passenger tire kissed the edge of the grass, then the driver's side. For a split second, as the Ranger rolled onto the camouflaged plywood, everything looked normal, like any other day they defiled my lawn. Then it happened. It wasn't a Hollywood explosion or a cartoonish crash. It was a deep, sickening crunch with splintering, earth-yielding, metal groaning followed by a jolt that sent the Ranger's front end plunging downward. The back wheels lifted slightly, leaving the truck tilted at a ridiculous angle, its nose buried in the pit like a dog that had misjudged a jump. A puff of dust and grass clippings rose around the hood, settling like confetti after a parade. Then, silence, broken only by the faint creak of the truck's suspension. The Ranger's doors flew open. Carl stumbled out, his face a mix of shock and fury, his wheeze louder than ever. Eddie scrambled from the passenger's side, pale and wide-eyed, patting himself down as if checking for broken bones. They stared at the truck, then at the hole, back at the truck, their expressions shifting from disbelief to horror to raw, unfiltered rage. It was a sight to behold, and I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile before taking a sip of coffee. With deliberate calm, I set my mug down and stepped outside. "Morning, gentlemen," I said, my voice as pleasant as a Sunday brunch host. "Having a bit of trouble, are we?" Carl whirled around, his face crimson, sweat already beading on his forehead. "You, Thornton," he bellowed, spittle flying. "What in the hell did you do?" Eddie, still speechless, pointed a trembling finger from the truck to me and back again, like a kid tattling on a playground. I widened my eyes, feigning innocence. "Me? I haven't done a thing. Though it looks like your truck ran into a pre-existing subterranean ground installation. Quite a surprise, I bet, when you ignore clear warnings." I gestured with my coffee mug toward the shiny aluminum signs flanking the pit. "Says right there," I continued. "Unauthorized vehicle subject to immobilization by subterranean displacement. Pretty straightforward. You did read the signs, didn't you?" Carl's jaw worked like he was chewing gravel, but no words came out at first. Finally, he sputtered. "This is vandalism. Destruction of HOA property. I'm calling Margaret. I'm calling the cops." "Be my guest," I said, shrugging. "My property, my signs, your choice to park here despite explicit warnings. I believe the term for your truck situation is predictable outcome." By now, the commotion was drawing a crowd. Mrs. Evelyn Carter was at her window, her grin so wide I could see it from my porch. Mr. Larson stood on his lawn, looking stunned but with a flicker of amusement in his eyes. A few other neighbors poked their heads out, drawn by the sight of the HOA's precious Ranger stuck like a pig in a poke. The spectacle was growing, and I was the ringmaster. True to his word, Carl was on his phone, jabbering to someone, probably Margaret, with the urgency of a man reporting an alien invasion. Eddie paced, muttering curses and kicking at the dirt displaced by the truck's fall. I leaned against my porch railing, sipping my coffee, and waited. The piece de resistance was coming, and I didn't have to wait long. Margaret Voss arrived like a hurricane in a golf cart, her HOA-funded chariot skidding to a halt at the curb in a cloud of dust. She was out before the cart stopped moving, her face a thundercloud, her designer loafers clicking on the pavement. "Thornton!" she shrieked, her voice hitting a pitch that could shatter glass. What is the meaning of this outrage? You've damaged HOA property. You've endangered our security team. I took another sip of coffee, using her first name to needle her just a bit. Margaret, good morning. As I was explaining to your boys, they ignored multiple clear warnings posted on my private property. They drove onto my lawn again, after being asked not to, and ran into an unfortunate consequence. Though if they'd read the signs, it would have been entirely avoidable. I pointed to the signs, their text looming large. Subterranean displacement, Margaret. It's all there in black and white. She stormed to the edge of the pit, peering down at the ranger's sorry state, its grill kissing the dirt. Her loafers were inches from the crumbling edge, and for a fleeting moment, I imagined her tumbling in. This is a trap, she raged. A booby trap. It's illegal. Actually, I said, pulling a folded packet of papers from my pocket. It's a defensive measure on my private property, clearly warned against. I handed her copies of my property survey, photos of the tire tracks from weeks of violations, dated images of the signs, and highlighted HOA bylaws about respecting private land. I've got video footage to your team parking here despite earlier signs, and them laughing at these new ones just this morning. As for the pit, I'm an excavation man, Margaret. My work meets professional standards. That's an 8-foot engineered depression, stable and fit for purpose. Her eyes bulged, her perfectly styled hair seeming to quiver with her fury. She looked ready to explode, but before she could, the police arrived, 2 officers in a cruiser, probably wondering why their morning was being interrupted by suburban drama. Officer Daniels, the senior of the pair, listened as Carl ranted and Margaret shrieked about lawsuits and public safety. I stayed calm, presenting my documentation, the survey, the photos, the videos, and the certified mail receipts from my unanswered letter. I pointed out the sign's wording, emphasizing the assumption of risk clause. Daniels reviewed everything, his face neutral. He walked to the pit, glanced at the truck, then at the signs. Finally, he turned to Margaret. Ma'am, this looks like a civil matter. Mr. Thornton marked his property and posted specific warnings about parking here. Your driver ignored them. You'll need to arrange for the vehicle's removal. Margaret sputtered, throwing out terms like HOA authority and imminent legal action. Daniels shook his head. He can put whatever signs he wants on his land, as long as they're legal. These are clear. You parked on his property. That's on you. The officers took a few notes, confirmed no one was hurt, and drove off, leaving Margaret apoplectic and the ranger still stuck. The crowd of neighbors grew, some openly smirking, others whispering excitedly. Evelyn Carter gave me a subtle thumbs up from her porch. I'd won this round, but I knew Margaret wouldn't go down without a fight. The real battle was just beginning. The moment the police cruiser pulled away, leaving Margaret Voss fuming beside her stranded Ford Ranger, I knew I'd struck a blow. The HOA's prized patrol truck was nose down in an 8-foot pit on my lawn, its back end pointing skyward like a monument to bad decisions. Carl and Eddie stood nearby, looking like kids caught breaking a window, while a growing crowd of Willow Creek neighbors watched with a mix of shock, amusement, and dare I say it, admiration. Mrs. Evelyn Carter's grin from her porch was worth its weight in gold. But I wasn't naive. Margaret wasn't the type to slink away quietly. This was just the beginning of the real war. I broke the tense silence with a calm, pointed remark. Well, Margaret, I said, letting her name hang in the air, your patrol vehicle seems a bit indisposed. You'll want to call a professional recovery service. I'd suggest one with a heavy-duty crane and a light touch. Wouldn't want any more damage to HOA property or my lawn during the extraction. Her eyes narrowed to slits, her face a storm of rage. You will pay for this, Thornton, she hissed, her voice low and venomous. You'll pay for the truck, the recovery, and the emotional distress of my staff. This isn't over. I kept my cool, though her threat made my pulse spike. I don't think so, I replied, holding her gaze. As Officer Daniels said, this is a civil matter caused by your team ignoring clear warnings on my property. The signs spell it out. Vehicle owner assumes all risk, liability, and cost. That's the HOA, not me. Then, because I'd planned for this moment, I pulled a neatly printed invoice from my pocket, one I'd drafted the night before, just in case. This is for my consultation on unauthorized parking solutions and the provision of a temporary, custom-engineered subterranean vehicle receptacle, plus a small surcharge for ignoring explicit signage. Let's call it $500 for services rendered. Margaret's face went from red to a shade of purple. I'd only seen in overripe plums. She snatched the invoice, crumpled it into a ball, and tossed it onto my lawn, of course. "We'll see you in court," she shrieked, storming back to her golf cart. She nearly clipped Mrs. Larson's prize rose bushes in her haste to flee, her cart's President Voss plaque glinting mockingly in the sun. Carl and Eddie were left standing awkwardly by their maroon truck, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. "Guess you boys need to call a tow truck," I said, not unkindly. "A big one." The recovery process was a spectacle that kept Willow Creek buzzing for the rest of the day. First, a standard tow truck arrived, its driver a wiry guy named Mike who took one look at the pit and whistled. "Nope," he said, shaking his head. "You need a rotator, maybe a crane. That's going to cost you." He glanced at Carl, who was back on the phone, probably begging Margaret for instructions. I caught Evelyn Carter snapping a discreet photo from her porch, her eyes twinkling with delight. Margaret, who'd returned to oversee the operation from the safety of her golf cart, was forced to make more calls, her voice sharp and frantic. An hour later, a massive wrecker with a rotating crane arm rumbled onto the street. The process was slow and messy. The crew had to dig around the Ranger's front end, attaching straps and chains while the crane's hydraulics whined. The truck creaked and groaned as it was hoisted, inch by inch, from the pit. Naturally, their maneuvering tore up more of my lawn, churning the grass into a muddy mess far beyond the original hole. I stood on my porch, taking photos and making mental notes. Every divot was another point in my favor. The neighborhood grapevine, which had suddenly become as efficient as a newsroom, later reported that the recovery bill was well into four-figures cost the HOA, and by extension every homeowner, would have to eat. Margaret's face, as she watched the crane haul her precious Ranger free, was a study in impotent rage. The crowd of neighbors, now numbering at least a dozen, didn't bother hiding their smirks. Mr. Larson, usually the quiet type, even chuckled when the truck's muddy front end finally emerged, dripping with clay. But Margaret wasn't done. A few days later, I received a cease and desist letter from an attorney, dripping with legalese about willful destruction of property and reckless endangerment. It demanded I pay for the truck's repairs, the recovery costs, and some vague compensation for Carl and Eddie's trauma. I almost laughed. Instead, I forwarded the letter along with my mountain of documentation photos, videos, the property survey, my unanswered certified letter, and the sign's exact wording to my niece, Rachel, a corporate lawyer in Cleveland with a knack for cutting through nonsense. Rachel called me after reviewing the file, her laughter echoing through the phone for a solid minute. "Uncle Jack," she said, "this is the best thing I've seen all year. They don't have a leg to stand on." She drafted a response that was a masterclass in polite savagery. It detailed the repeated trespassing, the clear warnings, the assumption of risk clause, and countered with a claim for damages to my lawn from both the initial parking and the botched recovery. She also suggested, ever so gently, that Margaret's overreach might expose the HOA to bigger liabilities, like a class action suit from fed-up homeowners. We never heard from that attorney again. The real fireworks, though, came at the next HOA board meeting. Normally, these meetings were sleepy affairs, attended by Margaret and her small circle of loyalists who nodded along to her every whim. Not this time. Word of Operation Ranger Down, as Evelyn Carter had gleefully dubbed it, had spread like wildfire. The community center was packed, standing room only, with homeowners I hadn't seen in months. Some carried printed photos of the truck in the pit, others whispered about the recovery bill. The air was electric with something Willow Creek hadn't seen in years, rebellion. Mr. Larson, bless his timid soul, stood up first. He cleared his throat and, in a voice that grew steadier with every word, called out the patrol's intimidation tactics. "What exactly are we paying for?" he asked, holding up a photo of the Ranger being craned out. "This security team is costing us thousands, and all they do is harass people over petty nonsense." The room murmured in agreement, and others joined in. A woman named Susan, whom I barely knew, demanded a full audit of HOA spending, zeroing in on Margaret's fancy golf cart and the discretionary fund she controlled. Someone else played phone footage of the truck extraction, the crane's whine punctuating the room's growing unrest. Margaret tried to regain control, banging her gavel and insisting the patrol was vital for community safety. But her usual tactics, stern glares and veiled threats, fell flat. The crowd was done bowing to her laminated empire. Even her board allies, usually quick to back her, looked uneasy, their eyes darting to the exit. The meeting spiraled into chaos, with shouts for transparency and calls to revisit the patrol's budget. Margaret's face was a mask of barely contained fury, but for the first time, she looked small. The fallout was swift. Carl and Eddie were fired within days, scapegoats for Margaret's mess. She tried to spin it, claiming they'd gone rogue and disobeyed her orders, but no one bought it. The pit incident had peeled back her veneer of competence, exposing the petty tyrant underneath. The board, under pressure from the newly emboldened residents, called an emergency session. Margaret wasn't ousted, not yet. HOA politics are stickier than wet clay, but her wings were clipped. A financial oversight committee was formed, packed with skeptical homeowners like Susan and Mr. Larson. The patrol's budget was slashed, its duties reduced to handing out welcome packets and reminding people about trash pickup. The leased ranger was returned to the dealer, a quiet admission of defeat. As for my lawn, the HOA grudgingly settled for the damage, sending me a check just big enough to cover new sod and some landscaping. I didn't rush to fill in the pit area with plain grass, though. Instead, I turned it into a rock garden, with a small red maple as the centerpiece. It was striking, understated, and a subtle reminder to anyone thinking of parking where they shouldn't. Every time I looked at it, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The battle wasn't over. Margaret was still president, and I knew she'd be plotting her revenge, but I'd won this round, and the neighborhood knew it. The question now was whether Margaret would double down or if the tide of resident anger would finally sweep her out. Either way, I was ready. I'd spent 30 years moving earth, and I wasn't afraid to dig a little deeper if I had to. The rock garden where the pit once yawned was more than just a new feature on my lawn. It was a symbol, a quiet testament to the day I turned the tables on Margaret Voss and her HOA goons. The red maple at its center caught the morning light, its leaves a soft contrast to the rugged stones below. Every time I looked at it, I felt a surge of pride. I'd stood my ground, used my skills, and shown Willow Creek that even a retiree with a shovel could outsmart a tyrant. But the story didn't end with the Rangers' extraction or the HOA's grudging settlement. Margaret wasn't one to fade quietly, and the neighborhood was buzzing with the kind of energy that promised change. This was the final act, and I was ready to see it through. The weeks following the chaotic HOA meeting were a masterclass in suburban upheaval. Margaret Voss, once the unchallenged queen of Willow Creek, was on the ropes. The packed meeting had cracked her armor, and the residents, emboldened by the sight of her precious patrol truck stuck in my pit, weren't letting up. The new Financial Oversight Committee, led by Susan from down the street, dug into the HOA's books with the zeal of auditors sniffing out fraud. They found plenty to question: the leased ranger's exorbitant cost, Margaret's golf cart with its custom President Voss plaque, and a murky, discretionary fund that seemed to bankroll her pet projects. Whispers of misspending spread, and with them, demands for accountability. Margaret fought back, of course. She called an emergency board meeting, hoping to rally her loyalists and squash the rebellion. I didn't attend HOA meetings, weren't my thing, and I'd made my point with an 8-foot hole, but Evelyn Carter and Mr. Larson filled me in over coffee the next day. Margaret had tried her usual tactics, banging her gavel, quoting bylaws, and painting herself as the victim of a vindictive minority. But the room wasn't buying it. Susan presented a preliminary report from the Oversight Committee, complete with receipts and a line item for the Rangers' recovery bill for $200, a number that drew gasps. Someone shouted, "Why are we paying for her mistakes?" And the meeting erupted again. Evelyn said it was the first time she'd seen Margaret look genuinely rattled, her hands shaking as she tried to call for order. The pressure was too much, even for someone as stubborn as Margaret. A week later, the board announced a special election to replace her as president. She didn't resign outright, her ego wouldn't allow it, but she stepped back to focus on other community priorities, a flimsy excuse that fooled no one. The election was a landslide for Susan, who ran on a platform of transparency and common sense. Her first act was to dissolve the community patrol entirely, replacing it with a volunteer welcome committee that handed out newsletters instead of violations. The HOA's budget was restructured, with funds redirected to long-overdue projects like repaving the community center parking lot. Margaret's golf cart was sold at auction, the proceeds covering part of the recovery bill. It was a clean sweep, and I couldn't help but smile every time I passed the community center and saw the bulletin board free of her laminated decrees. My role in the upheaval wasn't forgotten. I'd become something of a local legend, the guy who buried the HOA truck. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to stopped by to shake my hand or share their own Margaret horror story finds for unapproved paint colors, threats over kids' chalk drawings on sidewalks. Evelyn Carter, my staunchest ally, brought me a homemade apple pie with a note that read, "To Jack, the hero of Willow Creek." I laughed it off, but the truth was their support meant more than I'd expected. After years of keeping to myself, I felt like part of the neighborhood in a way I hadn't before. Margaret didn't disappear entirely. She stayed in Willow Creek, her house still a model of HOA-approved perfection, but her influence was gone. I'd see her occasionally, tending her roses or driving her sensible sedan, her eyes avoiding mine. Once, at the grocery store, our carts nearly collided in the produce aisle. She stiffened, her lips pursed, and I gave her a polite nod. "Morning, Margaret," I said, my tone neutral but carrying the weight of our history. She muttered something and hurried off, her cartwheel squeaking. It was the closest I'd get to an apology, and it was enough. She'd lost her throne, and I'd reclaimed my lawn. That was a victory. The rock garden became a neighborhood talking point. Kids on bikes would slow down to stare, whispering about the truck-eating hole. Adults were more subtle, but I caught their approving glances. I didn't fill in the pit story for everyone. Some things are better left as legend, but I made sure the garden was impeccable, a daily reminder that I wasn't to be trifled with. The HOA's settlement covered new sod for the rest of the lawn, and I spent a satisfying weekend replanting, my hands in the dirt, the familiar ache in my muscles a comfort. My lawn was whole again, maybe even better than before, and every blade of grass felt like a trophy. Reflecting on it all, I realized this wasn't just about a lawn or a truck. It was about standing up to power, about refusing to let someone walk over you because they think they can. Margaret and her patrol weren't evil, they were just petty, drunk on their little fiefdom, and too arrogant to respect boundaries. I could have kept writing letters or arguing at meetings, but sometimes, words aren't enough. Sometimes, you need to dig a hole, set a trap, and let physics do the talking. Was it extreme? Sure. Was it worth it? Every damn second. My quiet retirement isn't as quiet as I'd planned. I'm still Jack Thornton, the guy who took on the HOA and won, and that's a title I wear with pride. The neighborhood feels different now, lighter, freer, like we've all remembered we're neighbors, not subjects. Susan's leadership has helped, but I like to think my pit played a part in waking everyone up. I spend my days tending my lawn, chatting with Evelyn over the fence, and occasionally fielding questions from curious newcomers about the rock garden's origins. I just smile and say, it's a long story. Looking back, I don't regret a thing. The blisters, the late nights digging, the tension of waiting for the ranger to foul it was all worth it for the moment Carl and Eddie's smug grins turned to shock, for the look on Margaret's face when the police sided with me, for the neighborhood's laughter as the crane hauled her truck out. That pit wasn't just a trap, it was a line in the sand, a declaration that some things are worth fighting for. My lawn was mine, and no one, not Margaret, not her goons, not 1,000 laminated rules could take that away. So what's the lesson here? For me, it's simple. When someone pushes you too far, you push back. Not with fists or shouting matches, but with something smarter, something they can't ignore. I used a shovel and a few well-placed signs, but the principle applies anywhere. Stand your ground, know your rights, and don't be afraid to get a little creative. Willow Creek is peaceful again, and every time I look at that red maple, I'm reminded that sometimes, to keep the peace, you have to dig deep, deep. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think about this story? Was I right to take such a drastic step, or did I go too far? Have you ever faced a bully like Margaret, whether it's an HOA, a boss, or someone else throwing their weight around? And what about the bigger picture? How do we balance standing up to injustice with avoiding violence or escalation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'm curious to hear your take, whether you're cheering for the pit or shaking your head at my audacity. Let's get a real conversation going about power, fairness, and what it means to fight back.